Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today on reforming HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery or CDBG-DR program. I'm Andy Winkler, the Associate Director of BPC's Housing and Infrastructure Project. Last year, BPC launched a task force of former HUD, FEMA, and other government officials to develop and elevate bipartisan policies to fix our nation's disaster response system. We also partner with the American Flood Coalition, working together to identify federal policies that promote adaptation to flooding and community resilience. Today, BPC is taking a closer look at CDBG-DR, a program that has allocated nearly $40 billion in just the past 4 years to support long-term disaster recoveries across the country, and which faces some key operational challenges. HUD officials, grantees, and other stakeholders have all voiced concerns that CDBG-DR dollars do not flow to communities in crisis quickly, equitably, or impactfully enough. Legislation to reform the program had some support in the last Congress, but fell short of passing. So we're going to hear shortly from 4 state and local officials who have managed disaster recoveries and CDBG-DR grants and explore the reforms that they would like to see Congress champion. Before I turn it over to our moderator for today's discussion, one little bit of housekeeping. If you're joining live on YouTube or Facebook, please use the chat to submit any questions you have for our panelists. The BBC team will be keeping an eye on these as we go and flag them for panelists. You can also submit questions via Twitter using hashtag BPC Live or by tweeting at BPC_bipartisan. Now let me introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Brian Kuhn. In addition to being a member of BPC's Task Force on Disaster Response Reform, Brian is the Vice President of Homeland Security and Emergency Management at IEM. He previously served as Florida's Director of Emergency Management, and few people know more about disaster preparedness, response, and recovery than him. So Brian, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's great to be here today. I appreciate it. Thank you for the offer. You know, as Andy noted, HUD's CDBG-DR program has become an increasingly important source of funding for disaster recovery and resilience efforts. After major disasters and an emergency supplemental appropriations, Congress has provided additional funding for recovery in the form of CDBG-DR grants to rebuild affected areas and start the recovery process. However, this process isn't usually quick or easy. At the end of the day, everyone's goal is to get the funds into the hands of disaster survivors more quickly. The state and local leaders we have with us today are leading their organizations in the delivery of CDBG-DR funded programs from a wide range of disasters, spanning more than 10 years, from Hurricane Sandy in New York City to the California fires, to Hurricane Harvey in Texas, and Hurricanes Irma and Michael in Florida. I am thrilled to be joined today by George P. Bush, who was elected Texas Land Commissioner in 2014 and again in 2018. As many of you know, the General Land Office, or GLO, is the lead agency for administering over $14 billion in HUD CDBG-DR funds on behalf of the state of Texas. Next, we'll have Dane Eagle, who oversees the use of Florida's $2+ billion in CDBG-DR grant award as Executive Director of the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity. Before being appointed to the position last September by Governor Ron DeSantis, Director Eagle served in the Florida House of Representatives starting in 2012 and was the House Majority Leader. Next, we have Nazir Movasagi, who has been essential in his role as Chief Disaster Recovery Officer in helping the California Department of Housing and Community Development plan and manage the use of over $1 billion in wildfire recovery funds. And finally, we have Amy Peterson, who has been widely lauded for her leadership of the New York City Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery. She has seen the city through the final stages of its Sandy recovery efforts, which included about $4.2 billion in CDBG-DR funding back in 2013. So panelists, your states and communities have all faced very different but equally devastating natural disasters in recent years. And some of you have faced repeat or overlapping disasters. Just to do some level setting, can you each take a few minutes to talk about the disasters you have faced and your role in supporting recovery efforts. Commissioner Bush?
Thank you, Brian, and want to thank my fellow panelists for joining, and also the Bipartisan Policy Center for all that they do to bring people from all parts of our country together to find solutions to some of our biggest problems that we face, and disaster recovery is not an exception. You know, at the Land Office, we were designated by Governor Perry about a decade ago to run CDBG-DR funds as they flow from HUD to the state of Texas. And since that time, we've taken on missions with FEMA. Hurricane Harvey, by far, is our most devastating storm, not only on my watch, but in our state's history, with over 120 billion, it's estimated, in property damage, and more importantly, an extended loss of life. And so with these dollars, we've been fast at work. We manage also about 14 other block grants since 2017. We've actually had several federally declared incidents as well. And so in total, we manage over 14 billion, but the majority of which is in response to Harvey. So a lot of work ahead, both on housing and mitigation. And so we're especially interested as a state to find solutions, working with our Republican congressional delegation, Democrats as well, that have been affected by a storm that affected the Sabine Pass, Beaumont, Port Arthur area, Houston Ship Channel, all the way down to Nueces County, Corpus Christi. So we're excited with this discussion. We're privileged to be here.
Thank you, Commissioner. Director Eagle?
Thank you, Brian, and everyone at BPC for hosting this. And as Commissioner Bush said, the panelists as well, it's really a privilege to be able to provide the insight that I've had in my short time here as director at DEO here in the state of Florida. As was said, Governor DeSantis appointed me in this position, and we deal with, while we deal with community development and therefore the HUD designation of CDBG funds, we also have business development and workforce development here. So while we have been inundated with the unemployment crisis and managing that, that was one of my first tasks in joining this department in September. And then in speaking with Governor DeSantis, he said, do not forsake or overlook what's happening in CDBG. We have over $2 billion here. That's administered over several years, but however, are dating back to storms of 2016 that need to get in the hands of the community. It does no good sitting in government coffers, whether it's the federal government or the state government or the local governments. It needs to be in the communities affecting the people, which is what it's intended for. So as I, got my hands dirty, rolled up my sleeves, and really figured out, where we are, it's surprising to learn that we're still administering funds to storms dating back to 2016. We've got Hurricane Irma and Matthew, which affected parts of the Big Bend in Northeast Florida. We got Hurricane Irma, which affected most of our state in Southwest Florida, specifically where I'm from. So I'm very familiar with that storm. And that hit in 2017. And then we've got Hurricane Michael, which hit the Panhandle as a Category 5 hurricane in 2018, and was pleased and honored to sign those grant agreements with the allocations when I joined the department in October of 2020. So while I was honored to be able to do that, it was 2 years after the storm hit. So we certainly got to speed up this process, and I'm glad to see that it's being addressed in a bipartisan manner. I don't blame any one administration or any one level of government. I think it's government in general. We as humans are imperfect by nature, and therefore government is imperfect, but we need to put our heads together and figure out how to speed up this process. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Thank you, Director. Maziar, you are the outlier here on the disaster side with addressing wildfires. Can you talk about some of the issues that you're using CDBG-DR funds for in California?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you for an opportunity to share our experience about wildfires with you all, because unfortunately, as we've seen in 2020, this is not a California specific issue anymore. States like Oregon, Colorado, and Wisconsin are dealing with this. So this might be a harbinger of things to come for other states as well. Our experience with CDBG-DR really started after the 2017 wildfires that impacted Northern California and Southern California, resulting in over 7,600 housing units being lost and 9 lives being lost. At that time, that was the worst wildfire disaster that California had dealt with. But unfortunately, the following year in 2018, we were hit with additional wildfires, again in Northern California and Southern California, resulting in over 17,000 housing units being lost and over 88 lives being lost as well. So the trend is unfortunately going worse. Our scientists are indicating that this year's April humidity data is showing the lowest levels in 90 years. And after the massive wildfires that we experienced last year, we are bracing for additional wildfires this year. For those 17 and 18 disasters, we were allocated a little bit more than $1 billion. And as was mentioned, we're still in the process of getting these funds into communities 3 to 4 years after some of these disasters. So this bipartisan work to reform CDBG-DR to improve its speed of delivery while maintaining its flexibility is an important discussion, and we're glad to be here to provide our input. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Amy, your jurisdiction has been at this longer than everyone else. Can you talk about the disaster that caused you to utilize these funds and how you've been using them since?
Yeah, and I'll even go back one disaster. My experience in New York City's experience with $1 billion HUD CDBG-DR grants goes back to 9/11 and the use of it in the rebuilding and recovery of Lower Manhattan and the community surrounding that area. And so I think it's just something to kind of remember that there are all different types of disasters which this funding is used for. But the more recent experience and why I'm here today is the use of CDBG-DR for New York City after Hurricane Sandy, with a huge commitment to housing. $3 billion of our funding went to housing, both multifamily housing, some of our public housing, and then the single family housing program and renters programs. We also supported infrastructure projects and businesses and other recoveries. And we also invested in workforce development within our housing recovery to ensure that kind of we connected the people who were impacted both to the resources to recover, but also to the jobs as part of that. And clearly, you know, kind of helping the single family population was a huge new challenge that New York City had never faced before, and learned a lot about all of these programs, and look forward to talking about that today and how they all interact together and how we can improve the experience for everyone involved in this work.
Thank you, Amy. You know, there's a lot of programs that help support disaster recovery at all levels across the country, but, you know, an increasingly important one, and the focus of this webinar is, of course, the CDBG Disaster Recovery Program. Commissioner Bush, I'll go back to you to start here. What critical and unmet needs has that CDBG-DR funding been able to address in your state?
Well, Brian, that's one of the benefits and why we're here to support codification of this program, because of the flexibility that it entails. And it's similar to the experiences we've heard in other jurisdictions, whether it be on the housing or the mitigation infrastructure side of the envelope. On housing, we've undertaken everything from rehab, reconstruct, to new builds, to flood-prone areas where we can buy out potentially constituents that are ready to raise their right hand and relocate to another community, to examining planning. And, you know, when you look at a city like Houston, which is usually between it and Chicago, one of the most densely populated areas of the country, you think about the potential growth there, being able to utilize these dollars to anticipate growth and advise local leadership, planning and zoning authorities as to where they should and should not develop. People forget that Houston is built right in the middle of the Katy Prairie, which is now about 40% of what it was, all taken down within and deforested within the last generation of housing in Texas. And also using some of these studies to advise our state legislature to re-examine how we implement building code in Texas, and making sure that we're up to pace with other parts of our country that have more rigorous standards. So the flexibility of these dollars, we hope, are maintained when Congress revisits, or hopefully visits, the idea of codifying this program, because it allows us to visit with constituents, hear their feedback as to where they want to devote these dollars, and target it appropriately instead of a top-down driven approach.
Thank you, Commissioner. Director Eagle, has that flexibility been useful for you in Florida, and how are you utilizing the CDBG-DR fund?
Absolutely. I think the most pertinent, or the best use of the funds that we've seen so far is through our housing programs. And the way we look at it is, look, your storm's hit by a hurricane. You would hope in a perfect world that your insurance is going to cover the damage. It's not always the case. There's always a deductible, and they may not cover all of it. And then, of course, there are those who are uninsured. Well, then we hope FEMA steps in, or there's small business development loans. There's other opportunities there. But then this fund to be able to come in at the absolute last resort, long-term recovery, is remarkable to be able to assist those in making sure their homes are up to speed. However, let's get back to how long it does take. I mean, there are folks, again, from my community in Southwest Florida, really the whole state, the Keys, you name it. Hurricane Irma hit in 2017, and they still have tarps on the roof. So I think that's the onus of what we're getting at today. But the funding is certainly helpful. It's certainly solving a need. I was in the panel with the governor last week, 2 weeks ago, I think it was, to be able to announce nearly $5 million in workforce training for the construction industry. There were folks there in the Panhandle who were in the timber industry, which was devastated when that storm came through and just knocked down all the trees like toothpicks. Well, now there's a job displacement issue, which has been compounded by, of course, COVID. So to be able to go in with these state institutions, colleges, or workforce vocational institutions and be able to infuse this kind of training at no cost to those individuals, that's going to give back generationally. They're going to be able to get that training in construction, welding, different trades that they can then pass on to their kids. So that's going to be remarkable for the Panhandle. There's certainly a need there. And these funds help us do that. Also, workforce, affordable housing. Affordable housing, much like the rest of the country, is certainly a big issue here in Florida. As we continue to grow and our economy increases, these cities become more urbanized. Your teachers, your firefighters, your police officers, they're having to move further and further outside of that central hub. So to be able to apply this workforce housing, in addition to the affordable housing that we already have the funds for, that's crucial as well. So we certainly do appreciate the funds. Of course, we just want to speed it up.
Well, thank you. Maziar, in some of our conversations leading up to today, we discussed not only the housing needs you have in California, but some of the infrastructure damage that occurred because of the wildfires and how you are using your funds to address that. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been able to use CDBG-DR for both housing and infrastructure in California?
Absolutely. This really speaks to the flexibility and applicability of CDBG-DR as a disaster recovery program. The wildfires were so strong and so ferocious in California that they literally melted the underground piping for utilities, for water, for sewer. So the damage to infrastructure was significant. On top of that, many of the deaths associated with the wildfires were related to lack of adequate roads, ingress, regress roads. So the ability to take a portion of CDBG-DR and address communities' infrastructure needs to make them more resilient and safer rebuilds for tomorrow, but also bringing in the infrastructure that's necessary to allow for additional housing development to happen is key. Many of our areas that burned in Northern California were primarily rural areas that lacked the big infrastructure that was needed, for instance, to allow for denser development to happen. So again, the flexibility of CDBG-DR to address infrastructure, as was mentioned before, there's a lack of skilled trade labor force in California. So being able to even use a portion of that to help with that skill force to rebuild housing has also been very critical. So CDBG-DR is going to be a critical part of disaster recovery for any state.
And thank you. Now, Amy, housing in your jurisdiction can look a lot different than it does in the other jurisdictions we're talking to today. Has the flexibility been as useful for you, and have the outcomes been what you've hoped to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think the flexibility is so important, and it was so nice to hear the mention of planning, right? I think that we certainly have been able to invest in the teams across our resiliency planning, city planning, buildings department, all of the groups that really need to come together to figure out how the city adapts to both the what happened in Sandy, but also the future. And so I think the flexibility in the funding is tremendously important. You know, we certainly didn't have a single family housing market in the way that the rest of the country does. And so really needed to figure out how to kind of build that capacity and the ability to use workforce funding and to do some creative things with the construction unions to bring on more resources to do that work was hugely important. but I think one of the things that became really apparent, and it's, you know, everything that happens so close to the disaster, it's difficult to do things in the way that you want. So the idea that now there's mitigation funding is incredibly important. But we were able to come up with some really community-driven projects that combined infrastructure funding and housing funding and acquisition, and really supporting entire communities who'd been practically devastated by the disaster has been really important to us. And so I think the flexibility is what's key in being able to do some projects that aren't just addressing one piece of a disaster.
Great. Amy, I'm going to come right back to you on this one to start, and then work backwards. And I do that because here's the question. You know, one of the most frequent concerns we hear from HUD officials, grantees, and other stakeholders is that the CDBG-DR funds do not flow quickly enough to communities in need. In your experience, and Amy, I'm starting with you because you've been doing this the longest in New York City, from where do these delays and inefficiencies stem?
Well, so I would say the process, right, to award the funding, to do the congressional amount, and then to go through the action plan process is incredibly difficult, and you're up against the real need on the ground of what the community needs to respond. And so I think the time that it takes to go through that process is what delays getting the money out. But I also think that there is a huge benefit to going through the process of really thinking about how to use funds that are more flexible. I think what was clearly missing after Sandy was a better coordination between the money that's immediately available, both the SBA loans and the NFIP payments just actually being accurate, and how that is connected to the money that the city is able to use through HUD CDBG-DR. I also, feel very strongly that there are immediate on-the-ground programs that we've all figured out how to make work and should be in place. One of which has been discontinued, the FEMA STEP program, allowing people to go in and do immediate repairs to have people be able to reoccupy their homes. That was incredibly important for the city after Sandy, and to be able to understand how that and SBA loans and NFIP are connected, and to be able to then get money out to people. The other piece that took a while to stand up and allow us to be able to do, but proved incredibly important and would have made it a lot different for people and how they might have responded to the disaster, was the reimbursement, which is something that happened and we were able to use, which was incredibly important. And then, if the city wants to actually do acquisition of people's homes, and you don't know, right? We pretend we know where the next disaster will be, but we don't, right? If you want to have that flexibility, you need to be able to have some money more immediately for that. So I think it's part of the process, and there's a way to I think there's a way to keep the flexibility and make the process move faster, and I think that's what we're here to talk about.
Good. Thanks, Amy. And Andy, take a note here. I happen to be with FEMA Region 2 Administrator Tom Fargione in San Juan, Puerto Rico on Friday, and we discussed the origins of the STEP program and the next iterations of the STEP program. I think that would be something your audience and many of you on the screen here are familiar with it as well, as to where that program has been and what that looks like down the road. But back to CDBG-DR. Maziar, you're the newer to this process than some of the others. How have you dealt with some of the issues we've talked about thus far, and the inefficiencies or delays that you have seen? How do you view as what they're arising, and how are you overcoming those?
Absolutely, and I have to, again say we're very appreciative of receiving more than $1 billion of federal aid. But I'll use the 2018 wildfires as an example. HUD didn't publish the Federal Register notice till January of 2020, so more than a year after the disaster. And then again, as was mentioned, I understand the logic behind requiring an action plan planning process, but we were required to do an action plan again, even though the 5 counties in the 2018 disasters overlapped with the 2017 disasters. So you basically had the same geography, same topography, same ecology, same demography of folks, and yet we had to go through an action plan process again to get to the same programs that were proposed in an original process. So I think shrinking the time or the need for a Federal Register notice, but allowing states also the flexibility to amend an existing action plan rather than having to do a brand new action plan after every single disaster will help reduce the timeline and reduce these gaps to get in. We fully recognize that the intent is for these DR resources to come in at the very end. Right now, even the 17 disasters, the PG&E settlement is being implemented right now. So part of our discussions a little bit later on also has to be a discussion of duplication of benefits for very low income populations as well.
Thank you. Director Eagle, about 7 months ago, you stepped into your role there, and I'm sure your staff spent a lot of time briefing you on this program and talking about how it was and where it got to go. What did they tell you about the delays and some of the things they've worked to overcome and how the path forward looks for you all?
Yeah, and I've been able to see a lot of it myself, but certainly we've got a great team here who's been really at it for several years, and then some who have stepped in with the new administration when Governor DeSantis took over in early 2019, and then had Hurricane Michael fresh to start working on. But certainly, I think as the others said, the number one thing is the Federal Registry. The time it takes for that to pop up for us to then begin working on the state action plan. And in states where we might be having repeat issues, whether it's the wildfires of California or hurricanes that we might be seeing in New York, Texas, and Florida, we already have action plans. And I think the idea of being able to amend something like that is great. But we also see that registry is not always succinct with the other ones that pop up. Now that we're working on our fourth storm, at least in the last 5 years, we've seen that those registries are pretty different each time. So it has taken us quite a long time to be able to go in and get that action plan stood up, get in the communities and do so. However, if we're able to maybe understand what that registry might look like ahead of time, we can get to work much quicker. So the idea of being able to amend a state action plan, I think, would be very helpful in having some uniformity in the program, at least as a base. I think that would be helpful as well.
Great, thank you. And Commissioner Bush, the same question to you, but I'm going to add an addendum to it, which is the next question to the rest of the group, which is, what of the current processes would you recommend that Congress or HUD change for future allocation? So what are the inefficiencies that you've observed? How have you overcome them? And subsequent, what changes could you recommend to improve it?
Well, to piggyback on the discussion on the Federal Register, we currently have 22 separate Federal Register requirements on 8 different block grants that we currently manage in the state of Texas. And so, we are thankful to Congress for the historically fast appropriation they made after Hurricane Harvey. I believe it was within 5 days before they appropriated the north of $5 billion just for housing. But the problem is when drafting those requirements, and not to belittle the huge responsibility that HUD and the DR staff have, because I've been told it's roughly between 40 and 50 full-time employees that are managing in excess of $100 billion, that it shouldn't take this long to draft what could be considered to be boilerplate from disaster to disaster. As long as we all agreed to what the national objectives are, eligible activities. In our case in Texas, it took in excess of 1 year on the 15 floods, and in 17 it was 6 months on the first tranche of dollars and a full year for a second tranche of dollars. So I think when the wordsmiths are getting together, putting their heads together in Congress, they really need to consider either a time cap or some sort of boilerplate language that can be utilized with the flexibility to amend when the federal government is negotiating with a state, county, or local government on their DR package. Secondly, one thing that hasn't been mentioned was some of our frustrations with the grant agreement. So after you wait for the rules, you go through your action plan, you go out to the public for their feedback, you translate that, and in some instances for us, it was over a dozen languages. Then you get approval from HUD. Then it was an additional 3-month to 6-month negotiating time period for the grant agreement. The last step in this, the legal agreement by which a state like Texas can then start drawing down dollars for deployment of the resource. again, I think there's a way in which we can all agree that a grant agreement can be codified, or at least reduced to boilerplate agreement that whereby the federal government feels that they have the recourse to go after mismanagement of dollars or fraud or abuse, which I think anybody on this panel would agree we should eliminate. But to add another half year to the process on the tail end, just right before you're able to communicate to constituents that the dollars are actually coming, it's frustrating. So those would be the two points that I would like to see when codifying this language.
Thank you. Director Eagle, what kind of changes do you think you'd recommend to HUD or to Congress?
Well, listen to the Federal Registry that we discussed. I think that could be helpful with Congress, of course, the allocations as well, and maybe having some base language when it comes to what that register might look like. I think some better technical assistance with HUD directly, and I again, no fault to them whatsoever. As Commissioner Bush said, you've got a relatively small amount of people working a very, very large budget and overseeing an entire country. Certainly, I think in certain cases where we're trying to get better clarity or technical assistance on some of these programs, we find that there is a delay in getting some feedback. Look, we're guilty as well at the city and county level as we're trying to get feedback to all of them. But I think that better communication across the board could do all of us a lot of wonders in being able to have some more timely responses.
Excellent. Mazier, how about you? What recommendations do you have?
Yes, the top of the list is to codify this program so we don't have to go to the federal register notice process. The other is some amount of flexibility in allowing states to say, if we have an ability to get resources to very low income households or very low income communities that really don't have any resources themselves to weather the couple of years before recovery funds become available, if states could get reimbursed for some targeted dollars to specific communities, I think that will also be really important. Now, what we've seen in some of the disasters is the very low income folks really are the folks who have no resources to really cover the 2 to 3 to 4 years before their housing is rebuilt. So some ability to go in and provide that funding to them and then get reimbursed later would be key. The other is, I know this is not necessarily CDBG-DR, it's a Stafford Act, but this duplication of benefit issue for very low income households. Again, in California, nobody's getting rich off of this program. For the folks in the very bottom, every single dollar counts. So this administrative requirement to account for duplication of benefits really becomes an additional hindrance to providing services to folks who really don't have anything else. And our housing crisis has really exacerbated the problem in these communities where you had virtual zero vacancy rates before the disaster. So folks are living in very untraditional housing situations. So whatever we can do to really help that group of folks and get reimbursed later would also be another opportunity.
Thank you. And again, Amy, your jurisdiction has been at this longer than others. You've seen the program evolve somewhat already. What further evolutions or revolutions need to occur? Yeah,
so I think it is all about, we know a lot that, New York didn't know, and certainly I think we've all, when we attend these events where we go, I think every disaster we build on what the group before us has done, right? We've learned from Louisiana, Texas, all of you, and I think you've learned stuff from us. And so it doesn't seem like we should be reinventing the wheel every time we start this. And I don't even think you necessarily need to kind of merge all the programs, right? Which is one idea that people talk about. You've got FEMA, you've got a STEP program, you've got an SBA loan. We should have some off-the-shelf type of products that are what we've all been doing with our CDBG-DR funds that can be made immediately available and still maintain the flexibility. The idea that we could do mitigation work and raise utilities when we come in and do a STEP program, clearly there's no STEP program at the moment, but when we do that, would be, kind of tremendous ability to get into a house once, make the changes that are really important and do something great. And I like the idea of kind of reimbursing us after the fact for that using HUD CDBG-DR funds. Setting up the acquisition and buyout programs in advance, just being able to offer to people immediately the option to buy their homes, not necessarily know for sure if it's a buyout or an acquisition, so we don't necessarily have to have figured out the future of our cities before we give out money and we buy people's homes. So I think there's a number of things, just better sharing of data between the systems, the fact that these poor people who've had the damage to their homes have so many people come in and do different damage assessments and have no idea what that means and how they're all interrelated. There's so many ways that I think we can kind of marry the processes together across the different programs, have some things that are ready to start off of the shelf, and still allow us to have the flexibility where we need it.
Thanks, Amy. Obviously the topic of today's conversation is CDBG-DR, but CDBG-DR is just one of the federal disaster assistance funds available. All four of you are fortunate to have some fantastic emergency management leaders in your areas. I've worked with all of them, Chief Kidd or Director Moskowitz or Mark Dillarducci or Deanne Criswell, who just left the city to go lead FEMA. All fantastic folks. And so as you've worked with them, what strategies, best practices, examples have you developed to improve the interagency or intergovernmental coordination, speed up the delivery aid to them? And do you have any recommendations to help other jurisdictions as they consider this merge and work with those FEMA funds to deliver better outcomes? Commissioner Bush, I'll start with you.
Well, first, I should probably second Amy's motion in terms of restoring the FEMA STEP program. For us, at least, it helped to immediately address the temporary housing needs of 20,000 Texans. And, even in Houston, you'll get pretty cold temperatures. So, I rest at bed at night thinking, wow, without that program, we wouldn't have been able to house folks in the middle of our winter. And I suspect that was the case during Sandy. In terms of what we're talking about here, I think it's matching the good of and the speed of the FEMA temporary housing solution with the follow-on permanent housing solution that HUD offers through its DR program, and somehow making those timelines synchronize a little bit better. One of the things that we had during our time after Harvey was not only having the flexibility of a STEP program, but telling constituents that they also had the opportunity to begin what was known, the acronym was DOLLAR, but it was the Direct Assistance Limited Housing Repair Program, which essentially was the down payment toward a permanent housing solution where the state of Texas would float the constituent, and knowing that CDBG-DR funds would be able to reimburse those constituents. And I think it wasn't a program utilized to the degree that we were hoping, but it was a vision that allows for a constituent to not worry about which agency is going to eventually deliver their permanent housing solution. It's more worrying about the tactics of just taking care of their family members, and that's what constituents ultimately should be worried about. And there have been proposals, congressionally speaking, that allow more flexibility on that under the Stafford Act that I certainly am in support of. You had mentioned Chief Nim Kidd just very quickly. One of the lessons we learned and what legislators demanded from an agency like ours is they saw these pots of capital from the U.S. Corps of Engineers, FEMA, HUD, and they wanted better coordination among the state agencies instead of having a stovepiped approach. And so we were required by law to merge with Texas Department of Emergency Management and our Water Development Board to start thinking about and deploying dollars towards infrastructure-related funds or needs, with funds that come from HUD, CDBG-DR, also Corps of Engineers and other federal agencies. So it forced us to re-examine how we deploy these dollars, get rid of the stovepipes, and work better together within our state agencies.
Excellent, thank you. And in a couple of minutes, everybody, I'm going to shift over some questions for the audience. I'll remind the audience, if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat, whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, or you can tweet them using hashtag BPC Live or @BPC_bipartisan. Director Eagle, you and FDEM Director Moskowitz were colleagues together at the Florida House of Representatives. Has that relationship between you personally as well as your organization been helpful as you implement this program?
It has. Director Moskowitz has been a great friend for many years, dating back to 2012. We came into the House together in different parties, but regardless, here we are at the BPC having this discussion. He's been a friend since then, and to have each other in these respective roles has been, I think, invaluable. His background, even prior to this in the private sector, has been in emergency management and procurements. So I've been able to really rely on him, on his knowledge as an attorney who deals with procurements. We kind of joked he's kind of like a former prosecutor who's now a public defender. He was on the side of the private industry trying to get the contracts with governments for emergency management. Now he's on the government side and he knows all the tricks to the trade. So he's been very helpful in at least management in those processes and understanding how this big government, and meaning the contracts from the feds, come down to the states and how we need to get it done quickly. That's been invaluable. But speaking of FEMA, I think being able to have some applicability to our standards in the HUD requirements would be extremely helpful. I'll name one specific instance, and I don't want to name the community or the people involved, but one community thought that they were doing right by them and following FEMA guidelines in order to be applicable for one of our competitive grants. And because they didn't follow the appropriate steps that were required by HUD, they were ineligible. We had to start the process over, and there was a huge need in that community. So in cases like that, where we have two different federal programs that aren't exactly syncing up, and through really, no fault of the community other than not understanding the bureaucratic jungle of what's involved, they're now ineligible. So I think having some sort of applicability across the board would be extremely helpful to these communities.
Thank you. Major, how about on your side? Any tips you've developed in your relationship with Cal OES?
Absolutely. We've learned a lot from the Cal OES partnership, and I say in two areas. One is data, being able to share information between agencies, FEMA data, HUD data, ACS data has really been really helpful in us being able to actually do a better job of seeing the impact to the communities. As I mentioned, some of our wildfires were in very rural areas, so being able to kind of identify what the needs are and prioritize them has been really key. I think the other opportunity we are exploring with our Office of Emergency Management is, can we set up, as Amy was mentioning, a housing program that is set up pre-disaster that can take a portion of direct housing resources from FEMA, supplemented with state resources, and actually build permanent housing that could be used by the disaster survivor immediately after the disaster. And once the disaster survivor has moved on or moved back to their house, that housing unit would be available to the community as a permanent affordable housing stock. I think this is one of those things where we have to explore in California, because we have this pre-existing housing crisis, and there's not a lot of opportunities for folks to stay in some sort of transitional or temporary housing. So those are some of the things we're learning on. The other thing I'd say is also the CDBG-DR folks, the housing folks, and the Cal OES folks modeling the behavior for our local governments after our multiple disasters. We've had situations where in a couple of our big cities, our housing folks and the emergency management folks at the local level have gotten together and are collaboratively planning together. For instance, the city of San Jose, our second largest city in California, is now mapping all the housing units designated for seniors with their housing and emergency management folks. So they have proper evacuation plans should a disaster hit, but also the housing folks have the data in order to identify what needs to get rebuilt and how much needs to get rebuilt much sooner after a disaster. So part of this is also modeling that behavior for local officials as well.
Thank you. And Amy, finally, you had a couple of months between when Administrator Criswell was nominated and when she was confirmed. So I hope you spent some of that time giving her an earful of what you'd like to see changed when she got to DC. So can you give us a sneak preview of what you hope she accomplishes for the country over the next few years?
Well, that might be too much of an ask, but I would say that it's been an honor to work with Deanne Criswell in New York City, and she really came to the job thinking about exactly what you said at the beginning of this question, right? How do you integrate the housing recovery work, the HUD CDBG-DR, with the FEMA work? And it's not just the STEP program, which will hopefully she'll implement, or FEMA IA, but flood insurance and the mitigation work. And so, I think FEMA has laid out a recovery framework that I imagine will be prioritized, especially now as we're all living through a completely different health disaster, and just really trying to figure out what does preparedness look like for a city. And I think we were new to the business, which my office isn't. We're not in the same position that other people who kind of continue to need to have these resources, but we recognized 3 years ago that we didn't want to lose all the people that knew everything that we had learned in the last years about disaster recovery and how to help homeowners, and where should that sit. And we've been talking specifically about how that both sits within our emergency management office with a link to our housing and resiliency team. And so it's incredibly important to connect the two, because recovery has to start before the disaster. I think data is a huge piece, right? If you're in a position to collect data from every renter that's impacted before a disaster, so that you actually know those people and know how they've been impacted and can track them, you're in a much better place than trying to do it after the fact when you get your HUD CDBG-DR funding. So it's incredibly important to integrate those two, and that's what we're working to do in New York City.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to shift over to some questions from the audience. They're starting to fill up my chat box on my screen here, so I'm excited to ask some of these. So I'll throw these out there. All of you don't need to answer all of them. So if you have an opinion on them, feel free. I'll just you can pick and choose which ones you like. I'm going to go to the first one. It says, these projects disproportionately impact communities of color. The economic spend associated with CDBG-DR has not been equitably awarded to qualified Black and brown firms. How can we change this? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a stab at that. And again, it not being a perfect system, I think that one thing we can do is just make sure we're targeting the vulnerable populations, make sure that they know that we're available, that these programs are applicable to their needs. And one thing we do try to prioritize, of course, getting the vulnerable communities that have been affected. We try to make sure that we're bilingual, and in this case, in Florida, Spanish, Haitian, Creole, making sure that they have someone they can communicate with who speaks their language, of course, is invaluable. Being able to have access, whether it's having a permanent site in that community or having pop-up mobile sites, which we utilize from time to time, just to let them know, hey, we're here today or through the weekend. Please come on by and learn more. And then also just having the applications available through multiple processes, whether it's inside or at one of our mobile pop-up sites, or online, or through a mobile app, which we've implemented as well. I think we can always do better, but just starting with those few things are invaluable.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go to the next question. This one is from Tom Frank of ENE News. He says, what has kept Congress from passing legislation that would codify the CDBG-DR program? What is needed to get Congress to pass such a law? And I'll add an addendum to that, which is there are, my last look on this, about 400 folks who registered to watch this webinar today, and certainly more will see it down the line and when it's recorded and put out on YouTube. So what is it that you have heard from Congress that they would like to see enacted in order to codify this, which many of you have spoken about, and how can all of us be of assistance in reaching that point?
Well, from my perspective, I mean, I just want to reiterate what Dane said at the outset, and that's, this conversation shouldn't be about the past and pointing fingers and blaming. It's really looking forward, because I think for those of us that are in politics and for those of us that aren't, have to realize that there's just shifting political winds, but this issue rises above all that, and it requires all of us to come together, represent our constituencies, and pass these meaningful reforms. So I think to answer the question, I think in the past it's just hasn't risen to the level to get out of committee onto the floor to get votes in both chambers. But here, think about this, right? So Texas, California, New York, and Florida are being represented here. That's a whole chunk of our country. And if we're spending an hour of our time on meaningful ideas of consensus, certainly members of our Congress can do it. So, I know we've invested a lot of our time, not only traveling to DC, but working with our delegation. Louisiana obviously is a super natural disaster hub as well. Love to work with everybody on this panel to continue pushing the ball, but would love for people to raise this with their members of Congress, working with relevant committees to get this language across the finish line.
Terrific. Anybody else thoughts on that one?
I'll just add to it, and I think Commissioner Bush is right. Maybe it's not the sexiest issue out there. There's certainly more political hot button issues that you might hear on the news, but as is said here, and the whole purpose of the conversation, this isn't a partisan issue. This is, I think, a win for everybody. So hopefully just things like this, being able to have this discussion in a bipartisan manner, and as was mentioned, we've got the 4 largest states in the union here, and both parties equally represented. I think it should raise the level of attention to our Congress people, and hopefully this is a good start, or at least it can reach their ears. That would be great.
Thank you. And I, for one, am ready for some unsexy political issues over the next few years. Next question is from a man who knows from which he speaks, Ed Johnson, former Chief Financial Officer for FEMA. Ed says, would a central federal funding source to cover all disaster needs versus separate for FEMA, HUD, SBA, Corps of Engineers, et cetera, with integrated policies, procedures, one stop, benefit the states? Mazir, I'll go to you. If there were just one big pot of money instead of the dozen or 2 dozen or 3 dozen that are out there now, be helpful to you?
I believe so, but I think the benefit really comes from the fact of being able to harmonize the back end of the office. It's not so much whether you have one single office that's putting out these dollars, but you could have these different programs, FEMA, HUD, SBA, Corps of Engineers working together. If on the back end, for instance, the environmental reviews in one department can be used for the other, or if the accounting systems are the same, or the reporting requirements from one can be qualified for the other, it really doesn't matter whether it comes from a single entity or not. It's that back-end administrative work that really entangles states administratively, and then also gets us in trouble sometimes with compliance issues and the payback. So I think there are ways to, like I mentioned, environmental standards, labor standards that could be harmonized, reporting standards that could be harmonized, that would speed the resources and maintain the flexibility that's needed with disaster recovery.
Thank you. Amy, the same question to you. I worded it as benefit the states, but I think, reword it to say counties or cities. Would that same flexibility be useful to you?
I mean, I think what's interesting, right, is some of the FEMA funds is a disaster happens and you get the funds based on pieces of work that happen, whereas the HUD funding is a lot more flexible and requires additional work, and the SBA loans is, individual people applying. Sharing data across those systems, whether it's because they're all coming from one place or because we're figuring out a way to integrate what happens for individuals and communities and cities and states through that is helpful. I don't think necessarily that kind of switching it all to a block grant is necessarily the answer, because I think some of the FEMA public assistance funding and individual assistance funding does have an ability to get out the door and get to people. So I think it would be a big undertaking, but certainly all the back end pieces, the requirement, exactly, the labor requirements, the environmental requirements, the who got what from whom and why, and solving for the very hard and difficult piece of duplication of benefits is something we need to tackle.
Good. Thank you, Amy. Commissioner or Director, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. Anything you'd like to add in terms of Ed's idea about a question about a singular federal funding source?
Well, to be honest, for simplicity of service, I mean, I think it's viewed to be an easy button. It's a proposal we've seen from members of Congress over the years, but I'm not sure that with these reforms that we're proposing today, as it relates to FEMA and HUD, that we can address many of the concerns that are out there in terms of the timing of the delivery of the service. And as Amy mentioned, when we create another entity, you create more problems for points of failure in terms of information sharing. So, first things first, I think if we're able to, work on an information sharing agreement between, say, FEMA and HUD for an individual constituent, that would be a quantum leap that we can take first. Before the idea of creating a new entity with its own budget. And because as we've learned, I mean, bureaucracy is just, it's what's hurting us. It's not interest in helping our fellow constituents. It's rather the additional steps that we have to go through. So let's try to work on the steps, reducing the steps that are there now.
Excellent, thank you.
I think my fellow panelists summed it up nicely. Certainly there are imperfections that we can make better. I don't know that a central hub is the best idea. It's not a bad idea. It could certainly work. I'll just point out that obviously FEMA is meant to come in almost immediately after a storm. Sometimes that takes longer, and the CDBG funds are more long-term. And I think that staggered approach is appreciated and is needed. We want to make sure that we are the funding of last resort, that there is a funding of last resort available to really make sure that those people who were not able to get the assistance they needed do have that opportunity. I think both programs could be expedited, of course, but I do think that a staggered approach is helpful.
Thank you. I've got about 4 minutes left for questions here. I'm not going to get to everybody in the who's asked questions, but there's some terrific ones coming in, and thank you for all of that. I'm going to end with one from Rachel Deary, who says, I'm interested in hearing thoughts on leveraging nonprofits as a resource in rebuilding housing, whether CDBG funding can be more flexible to include nonprofit participation. I know that all of you have had some terrific nonprofit support through this. Any thoughts on how CDBG-DR could be used to help with that? Amy, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important when you talked about equity before, you know, the idea that you've got the local community-based organizations engaged in this work. The other challenge that is so important. The other challenge we faced early on is that there was a bunch of funding that came in that went to nonprofits who did some work, and we didn't kind of match it necessarily with the people who would or wouldn't be eligible for the HUD funding. So figuring out the way to integrate nonprofits into this work, both we had groups that did legal and financial advocacy were located in our centers, and people stuck with our program much more often if they were connected to those resources. So in addition to construction, having those resources available, but certainly figuring out the way to get nonprofits involved in doing construction, figuring out there's a lot of nonprofits who'd be willing to do work above and beyond potentially what we would fund and could get outside resources for that. It's a challenge that we dealt with and came up with some ways to do it, but I think it's something that should be thought about more directly and figured out and put into kind of the ongoing process that we all use moving forward. Because it can be transformative for homeowners, especially ones who can't do the work themselves and would like to access someone who can help us do that work from their community.
Thank you. Director Eagle, I'm a board member of the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, and we're doing some work with Habitat for Humanity and others who are still doing rebuilding right now in the Panhandle. Any thoughts on how the current CDBG-DR programs could be improved to help enable some of the work that continues today in the Panhandle?
I think that's a great idea. I mean, our nonprofits are entwined in the community. They're the roots of the communities, and to be able to work more seamlessly with them, I think would take a lot of really burden off of us here at DEM. You know, we're a centralized hub in here in Tallahassee. Obviously, we try to get in the communities, but be able to work with them more closely would be invaluable. We work with a number of nonprofits, as you mentioned, Habitat for Humanity, the community action agencies, and then through our workforce division here, Career Source, we've got our 24 boards across the state who work with nonprofits when it comes to workforce. So to be able to have a little bit more seamless relationship, I'm all for it, as long as we have the accountability and transparency in place, which no doubt we would all push for, but I think it's a great idea.
All right, well, thank you. All right, with that, everybody, we are about out of time. So I would like to conclude today's webinar by saying thank you to Commissioner Bush, Director Eagle, Mazier, and Amy for joining us today. We truly appreciate your leadership and your insights on this important program. It's clear to us that the CDBG-DR program is a critical tool for communities in crisis, and there's a real opportunity for this Congress to advance some bipartisan reforms to provide assistance more quickly, efficiently, and equitably. I invite you all to stay tuned for more webinars and work from the BPC and its task force on this important topic and other aspects of disaster response reform. And I will conclude by again thanking my panelists, thanking the audience for joining the webinar today, and have a terrific afternoon. Bye, everybody.